Hello everyone. This is the first of a set of mini lessons that I'm going to do, just going over the key concepts from F212. Okay, so OCR F212. It starts with the biological molecules. Now, in many ways, you can think of water as being the first one of those and maybe the most important. Because if it didn't have a number of key properties, you could argue that the other molecules could not have had the right environment to evolve. So what we're just going to do is have a quick review of water's properties and how those properties are related to its very important function in life and living organisms. And then we'll move on to talking about how the structure of water explains those properties. Okay? So, if we just do a quick table here, very rough, but on this side I'm just going to list its properties. And on the other side we should be able to relate these to biological functions. Okay? Okay, so the first important property of water is that it is a liquid. Now, some of this is going to be obvious, but you need to be able to make these connections quite clearly, and so you need to understand it. So the first property of water that's very important is that it is a liquid. And what significance that has for biological organisms is that it provides a way for things to be transported between different parts of the organism. So because the particles of liquids are usually in motion, it provides a very good way to take something from point A to point B. So for example, glucose, things like oxygen, I might just write that down. Things like glucose, nitrates for plants, oxygen, these things, because they're in that liquid, they can be moved around very easily. And even in terms of water transport itself, processes like osmosis, they depend on water to be a liquid. So I know it's a very obvious thing, but it has very important biological consequences. Okay, so the next thing is that water is cohesive. Okay, there's enough attraction between water's molecules that they tend to remain intact unless a very large amount of energy is given to those molecules. So that gives them the property of cohesiveness, i.e. the ability to be attracted to each other within the same substance. Okay, now this is very important in plants because it allows the capillary action in the xylem vessels so that water can essentially move against gravity from the roots towards the leaves and other tissues and organs where it's needed. Okay, so the capillary movement in plants. Okay. Also, other property of water that's very important is that it is a solvent. It can dissolve a very large number of different types of molecule, and because it can dissolve these very biologically important molecule, dissolves biologically important molecules, it provides the ideal it provides the ideal environment for biochemical reactions, because all these molecules that need to react to form more complex molecules, or even complex molecules that need to be broken down, all of these reactions have the right environment because of water. So, for biochemical reactions. Okay, that's all because water is able to act as a solvent for all those molecules. Okay, and again, because it's a solvent, because it can dissolve things like glucose, things like nitrates, oxygen, because it can dissolve those things, it's also another factor why it's a good transport medium. Okay, so the other thing is its thermal stability. So we're going to come to this a bit later on to explain these things. Thermal stability. Because of water, what that means, firstly, is that water's temperature doesn't change as much as the atmospheric temperature is changing. So it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water, and because of that, water's temperature more or less stays relatively constant. And because this prevents large changes in the temperature, it's good for biological organisms and their enzymes. So all these biological processes, so biochemical reactions, they can still carry on because a good optimum temperature is maintained for those enzymes. Okay. Right. Now the other thing, and the other point with thermal stability is if the temperature of water isn't changing too drastically, it means that on the one hand it's not freezing too often, and on the other end of the scale it doesn't get too hot, so that it's turning into a gas. At the same, so you got to understand that point, that because of the thermal stability, it's not getting too cold and it's also not getting too hot. Right. So the other thing is this very unique property of water that when it freezes, it becomes less dense. Okay, so usually when you go from a liquid to a solid, it follows that things become more dense. But water goes the opposite way, it becomes less dense, and so ice tends to freeze. Water tends to freeze, forming ice at the top of a body of water. Now, what that means is it insulates the water below it. All right, and we'll discuss these properties later, but because of that, it keeps large bodies of water liquid, keeps large bodies of water as liquid, and that allows the living organisms to survive. Okay, allowing survival of the aquatic organisms. Okay, and the other thing is, because ice floats at the surface, it also, if you look at it from another point of view, it also provides a habitat for all those organisms above the surface of the water. Okay, so those are the key points in terms of the functions, summarized here greatly, so please do go over the details yourself, but this is just a quick summary of the functions. The main part of the discussion is going to be how can we explain these properties in terms of water's structure. Okay, so that's what we'll do next. Alright guys, so now we are going to try and explain the properties of water that we've just discussed, and think about how those properties are linked to the structure of water. Okay, so let's begin then with the bonding of the water molecule itself. So there's an oxygen, which is this one right here, and it has got two covalent bonds with two hydrogen atoms right here. Okay, now the covalent bond is very strong. Okay, it's essentially a sharing of electrons, okay, between um, the oxygen here and the hydrogen here, so that itself is one bond, and the second covalent bond is between the oxygen here and the hydrogen there, and that would be another bond right there. Basically, it comes down to the positive nuclei of the hydrogen and oxygen both being attracted to the shared pair of electrons. So here, the oxygen and hydrogen are both being attracted to the central electrons between them, and that is what's making them attracted to each other. Okay, so that's what is going on in terms of the bonding, and we need to have that in our minds as we move on with our discussions. Okay, so let's just simplify this diagram a little bit. If we then get rid of that, okay, I can't do that. So we can draw that in a much more simple way, i.e. the oxygen is covalently bonded once to a hydrogen and again to another hydrogen. Okay. Now, these electrons, we can think of them as being like a cloud around the nucleus of the oxygen as well as the hydrogen, and they're constantly moving around. Sometimes they'll be around the hydrogen, sometimes they'll be around the oxygen. Now the thing is that oxygen and hydrogen do not share the electrons equally. So, in fact, it is an unequal sharing of electrons. Okay, it's unequal. Oxygen, these electrons spend much more time around the oxygen than they do around the hydrogen. Okay, like so. Now, because each electron is negatively charged, what this means is there's a much more negative charge around the oxygen, and we show that using a sign called delta negative. What that means is oxygen has a slight, very slight extra negative charge compared to the hydrogens. And so you can extend that by saying that the oxygen, therefore, has a slight positive charge. Okay, so because of this unequal sharing, electrons spend more time around the oxygen than the hydrogens. Therefore, oxygen develops a slight negative charge and hydrogen develops a slight positive charge. Okay? And this is what we call polarity. We describe water as being a polar molecule because it has these two poles. We draw a line over there. Water has clearly got a slightly positive pole and a slightly negative pole. Just like a magnet would have its north and south ends, the same way polar molecules have some part of them which are negative and some part of them which are positive. And this essentially is the structural aspect of that's going to explain all of water's properties. Okay? Then let's continue. If we just recap water's properties, remember they were that it's a liquid, it's cohesive, i.e. its molecules are attracted to each other. It is a very good solvent, can dissolve many substances or other molecules, and those molecules are important for biochemical reactions. It's got a high thermal stability. That means its temperature doesn't change very quickly, and that it freezes to form a less dense solid. Okay, and one other thing which we didn't mention was that it also takes part in metabolic reactions. Okay, so it's not just there in the background of those reactions, it takes part in some of those reactions as well. We'll call that its metabolic property, but for our purposes of discussion of structure, it's not really essential to that. Okay, so let's begin then. We've just discussed that water is a polar molecule. So how does this affect water's properties when there's lots of water molecules around? So let's just take a few as an example here. Right, so we've got a few water molecules there. So we've discussed that there's a slight positive charge on these hydrogens and a slight negative charge on the oxygens. Now, positive and negative, just like the north and south ends of magnets, if you put them two together, the opposites will attract each other. And in the same way, the slight positive charges of the hydrogens of these molecules will attract the slight negative charges of the oxygens on other molecules. And what that means is each molecule is attracted to another molecule by means of a hydrogen bond. Now, the hydrogen bond can be shown as a line like I have just done there. It can also be shown as a line like that, the same way that hydrogen is slightly positive, that oxygen is slightly negative, or it might be shown sometimes as a dotted line between the oxygen and the hydrogen. That's pretty much the only way that it will ever be shown. Okay, it will never be shown as a straight line, but you must remember that the hydrogen bonds have a very specific way that they are shown in diagrams, and these are the three ways. So because these different molecules, remember we've got 4 separate molecules here, and they're all attracted to each other by the hydrogen bonds. Because of that, you can think of these bonds acting like a glue that's keeping these molecules attracted to each other. And that explains our first property, which is the fact that water is cohesive. Because of these hydrogen bonds, water molecules are attracted to each other, which means that they are cohesive, which means if I pull on this molecule right here, all the other molecules will follow because there's this attraction between all of them. Okay, and that's cohesiveness. Right, next, because these molecules are constantly in motion, some bonds will break and new bonds will form. So say this bond might break and new bonds might form. And if new bonds are forming and old bonds are breaking all the time and these molecules are constantly in motion, that explains why water is a liquid. So even though there's attraction between the molecules, it is a weak attraction. The hydrogen bond is a weak attraction because these charges are only very slight, positive or negative. And because the attractions are weak, they can easily be made and formed. But nonetheless, they are there and they will allow the molecules to move around. And because of that, because the molecules can move, water can act as a liquid. Water will behave as a liquid. Okay? Okay, so we've discussed why the structure of water allows it to behave as a liquid and why it's cohesive. Now, the same way, it's a related property, is its thermal stability. It's related to that. So we discussed why, because of the hydrogen bonds between the oxygens and hydrogens of different water molecules, because of that attractiveness, water is cohesive. And because the particles can still move around, because those bonds are weak, it can be a liquid. For the same reason, water has a high thermal stability. What that means is it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water. And that makes sense if we realize that changing the temperature essentially just means increasing the kinetic energy of the molecules, which in simpler terms means increasing the amount that they can move. Okay? Now, in order to get these particles to move more, we need to be able to, or in order to increase their temperature, we need to make them move more. But the only way to make them move more is to break these hydrogen bonds first. If we can do that, then the particles will move more and then their temperature will go up. But because these bonds take a lot of energy to break, you can add a lot of energy to water before that temperature starts to go up, before the water molecule water molecules start to move more. So again, because of the hydrogen bonds that are keeping these water molecules together, we are preventing the water molecules to move more. So that is the reason why water has a high thermal stability, because a lot of energy is first taken to break those hydrogen bonds. If the hydrogen bonds weren't there, the temperature of water would go up faster because there's nothing stopping the water molecules from moving. Okay? Okay guys, so we've discussed why the structure of water allows it to behave as a liquid. We've discussed why, because of the hydrogen bonding between water molecules, it is cohesive. And we've discussed why it has a high degree of thermal stability. Next we're going to discuss what makes water a very good solvent, i.e. why are many things able to dissolve in water. Now, I like to think of it all coming down to this one word: interaction. Okay, and that is dependent on attraction. So because water is able to interact with lots of things, because there's a high level of attraction between water and other substances, that's why it can dissolve them. There are some things such as oil that it can't, and that is for the same reason, because there is no attraction with those molecules and therefore there is no interaction with them. So just for this example, we've got a glucose molecule here. Now if you can apply what we did before, you can see that there are a number of OH bonds. So there's one right there, there is one right here, another one there, another one there, and another one here. Now the reason I've drawn out all the bonds, or most of the bonds here, is to show in the same way that water has got polarity because of its OH bonds, i.e. it's got certain slightly negative parts and certain slightly positive parts, in the same way molecules like glucose also have slightly negative and positive parts. So for example, that oxygen is slightly negative and that hydrogen is slightly positive for the same reasons as before. That bond is not an equal share of electrons. Same way that hydrogen is slightly positive and that oxygen is slightly negative, and so on. So bearing that in mind, what we're just going to do is just illustrate how water could interact with this molecule. So what would happen is, for every slightly positive part, water would arrange its slightly negative part towards it and form a hydrogen bond. So for example here there's a slightly negative part, and so water would arrange its positive end towards it and form a hydrogen bond there. And there will be a slightly negative part pointed towards that hydrogen there, and hydrogen bond. And there will be a water molecule there, forming a hydrogen bond in that way. So wherever there's a slightly negative part, hydrogen will arrange its positive end towards it, and whenever there's a slightly positive part, water will arrange its negative end towards that, and in that way it can completely surround the whole molecule. And that's essentially what dissolving is. Every single particle or molecule or ion will be surrounded by water molecules if they are able to form these hydrogen bonds. And that is only possible when a substance itself is polar. So glucose is polar, and therefore it can interact with water, it can form hydrogen bonds, and therefore the water molecules can surround it. In the same way, when a salt crystal is placed in water, all the water molecules surround each and every sodium ion and each and every chloride ion and separate them. And therefore that crystal is no longer visible because each of the individual ions has dissolved. And it's all because water can interact with each of those ions or molecules because it has an attraction for it. Okay? And that is why water can dissolve many substances, and that is why it is such a good solvent. And because all these important biological molecules can dissolve in water, water provides the environment where they can all react with each other. Okay? Without that, without being dissolved, those molecules could not react with each other, and all the important biochemical reactions could never happen. Okay. Okay, so that brings us to our final property of freezing, and to try and explain, using the structure of water, why is it that when water freezes it becomes less dense? Okay, so if you think of water molecules in a liquid like this, try to imagine them moving around constantly all the time, forming hydrogen bonds in one place, others breaking, but constantly moving around. But the key point is that there are no gaps between the molecule. There are no intermolecular spaces. Okay, not much space between the molecules. Okay, hydrogen bonding, yes, keeping those molecules together, but constantly moving around. Okay. However, as you start to take energy away from those molecules, they slow down. The kinetic energy goes down, obviously, because their temperature is going down. Kinetic energy is going down, and what you will find is that they will start to take up a new arrangement. Now that new arrangement has got a maximum number of hydrogen bonds possible. So, as you take that energy away, you'll find that the structure of those molecules, the arrangement becomes very highly organized to maximize the number of hydrogen bonds possible. So it will start to take up a very regular kind of arrangement where every water molecule is trying to maximize the number of bonds it can make with other water molecules. Now, as this structure continues, it forms a very regular lattice structure. Okay, so this structure can just keep on continuing as it would in the lattice. Okay. But you will notice now that there's a lot of space now in this new structure. There's a lot of space between the molecules. So all this extra space that wasn't there in that structure. Okay. So that is the reason why when water freezes, it becomes less dense, because in the arrangement of the lattice or the crystal structure of water, there are many more intermolecular spaces, and because of that extra space, water is less dense. Okay, and so this structure will then float on top of the water below it, and because there's it's less dense, it has another important property, which is it is insulating. Okay, it will insulate the water below it so that the water below it doesn't become as cold as the ice, and therefore the water below remains as a liquid, and so all the living organisms can still survive because the water below has not frozen. Okay, and that brings us to the end of that. So I will be updating the channel with more videos as we go through the course, so keep on the lookout for them, and good luck.